Production costs for this program were underwritten by the Coastal Heritage Society, which operates Old Fort Jackson, the Savannah History Museum, Roundhouse Railroad Museum, and 1779 Battlefield Memorial in Savannah. Online at chsgeorgia.org. How many people does it take to change the world? Can small towns and rural areas make as big a difference as large cities in deciding the fate of a nation? In the mid-1940s, more than 30,000 coastal Georgians helped hammer together close to 200 ships that turned the tide in World War II. This is their story, Ships for Victory. For a grueling 68 months, beginning with the start of hostilities between Britain and Nazi Germany in September 1939, and not ending until the surrender of Germany in May 1945, German submarines known as U-boats savaged Allied shipping in the Atlantic. Eventually, Allied tactics and espionage were able to turn the tide against Hitler's U-boats. But throughout 1942 and into early 1943, the pendulum swung decidedly in Germany's favor. German U-boats sank 125 ships in May of 1942, the peak of their successes against American and British shipping.
Grandchildren.
Retired Savannah merchant mariner Carl Franklin experienced the brunt of those attacks personally, surviving 3 sinkings at the hands of German U-boats. The first came against Carl's freighter, the SS Oakmar, which was on a mission to the Middle East in the days just prior to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor.
This is December the 5th, 1941. We were in Cairo, Egypt.
3 months later, Carl and his shipmates almost lost their lives when a German torpedo slammed into their ship.
Captain Cole, general alarm, all hands on deck. So we all went up midship and we put a boat over on the port side and lowered it, and everybody piled in.
The German submarine surfaced, fired a final shot into the Oakmar, and then slipped back beneath the waves, leaving Carl and the other survivors afloat in the middle of nowhere without adequate food or water.
Wasn't very long, though, before she started going down by the head. Ship did. Ah, it was scary. Scary. If I didn't have 28 other guys with me, I don't know what I'd done.
Days later, Carl and the other survivors were picked up by a passing foreign freighter and dropped off safe and sound in Bermuda. It made front-page news back home in Savannah.
The survivors were landed here yesterday afternoon by a Swiss ship.
Carl became something of a shipwreck celebrity and was even interviewed by Atlanta radio reporter John Fulton.
I think you've walked away from quite a few of the torpedoings back in the early days of the war. How many to be exact?
3.
3. Can you tell us about where, or not rather where, but when those torpedoings took place?
Well, the first was in March 42, and the second was in March 43, and the third one was in July 43.
Well, since July 43, you've been sailing and getting back all right, is that right?
Right.
Well, now, March is not exactly what you might call your favorite month, is it?
No, I can't say it is.
Fulton may have been able to chuckle about it by war's end, but in the early days, submarine attacks were no laughing matter. In all, German subs sank more than 2,800 ships, displacing just less than 15 million tons. The voyages were so dangerous that every merchant marine sailor stood a 1 in 26 chance of dying at sea. That's the highest casualty rate of any branch of service in World War II. To even the odds, America turned to its massive industrial capability and produced an answer, the Liberty ship. The Liberty was the maritime equivalent of the Model T Ford. Mass-produced at 18 shipyards around the country, the 2,700 Liberties cranked out over the course of the war were identical. They weren't pretty, fast-moving, or heavily armed. Instead, the Liberty's strength lay in the speed with which the yards could send them to the sea. Pioneering West Coast shipbuilder Henry Kaiser developed a system for welding entire sections of the ship together in the dockyard, then hoisting them into place atop the already laid keel. The name Liberty Ship came from founding father Patrick Henry's quote, "Give me liberty or give me death." But these big ships carried more than fighting attitude. At 441 feet long, each Liberty could carry more than 9,000 tons of cargo, about the same capacity as 300 railroad freight cars. One Liberty could haul 2,840 jeeps, 440 light tanks, or 230 million rounds of rifle ammunition for the troops.
We weren't building them for attractiveness. We were building them for their usefulness.
And durability.
Well, this was an ugly ship, and it wasn't glamorous or glorious, but these were the workhorses. These were the ships that did the work behind the scenes, and they were magnificent in that way.
Two shipyards in coastal Georgia played a big role in that outcome, producing just under 200 vessels. They were the Southeastern Shipyard in Savannah and J.A. Jones in Brunswick. Well, this is all that's left of the old J.A. Jones Shipyard in Brunswick. Even now, you can tell how big this place was, but let your mind wander and think about what used to be here. These concrete walls, like the one I'm walking on now, would have been topped with huge scaffolding, several of them in a row that just rose up out of the marsh like high-rises coming out of the mud. Over in the adjacent yard, they would have welded together entire complete sections of the ship, picked them up like toys, put them down on top of the keels, and just welded them together like Legos. And 16,000 people would have been crawling all over this place day and night, 24 hours a day, trying to win the war for America. Southeastern and Jones were economic powerhouses, each employing more than 15,000 people at their peak. It's not an exaggeration to say the shipyards brought coastal Georgia out of the Great Depression.
Yeah, Jones and Savannah shipyards really played I would say, the pivotal role in the economy of coastal Georgia during the World War II years. The population of Brunswick exploded. It was a city of about 10,000, and it really exploded, tripled almost overnight because of the shipyards.
Brunswick mushroomed overnight. Can you imagine that many people moving in and having to have places to live and grocery stores and all the things that a small city needed? And of course, people in Brunswick and Glenn County are still reaping the benefits of that shipyard.
So many temporary houses, just row after row after row. There were places where people would rent beds, and literally they would have the bed for 8 hours. Somebody would come take their place and sleep for 8 hours. The turnover was just fantastic, unbelievable. So many people came in, to build the ships.
All being in the street was nothing like a sidewalk. So many people walking to work the shipyard. You see, this something look like New York now. You just people that in the streets rubbing against one another, trying to get to where they're going.
Southeastern Shipyard published a newsletter detailing every facet of life in the yard, including shipyard baseball team scores and announcement of after-work activities. There's even a short note about worker Emma Kelly from Statesboro, who went on to fame as the lady of 6,000 songs in John Barrett's book, Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. The Savannah and Brunswick yards cranked out an average of one ship per week, and they were far from the fastest in the nation. The builders at J.A. Jones even volunteered to work one Christmas without pay just to make sure the ships were finished in time.
We had a little Christmas tree on our way and sang Christmas carols that day and pulled a double shift and gave the money away.
The output at the yards required round-the-clock work by laborers like Robert Haymans of Richmond Hill, who was a welder at Southeastern.
Well, they had 6 ways built for ships. I mean, that one year like that it went 6 wide, just as good as it could be, the size of the ship, and all would be welded up in big sections, and they'd pick it up in them big sections and set it on that ship, and just about every week a ship went out of there, and one place or the other.
The work was hard and the hours were long, but the laborers worked together to get the job done. They knew their country's future depended on it.
No, it was something you had to do. I mean, to get that ship going, you build a certain part of it, you weld a certain part of it, somebody else not ever weld it. Anything they wanted welded, we welded it. I welded up on the ship as well as I welded out on the yard. Wherever I was needed at most, that's where I went.
Welder Bill Reese had a personal reason for working at Southeastern Shipyard.
I was of draft age, and they were getting ready to send me away from my young little wife, and I wanted a job I could stay on, so I wound up in the shipyard and was told at Fort Mac, if you'll stay on the shipyard and work every day, we won't call you back up here. As a welder, my part was to put it together where it would stay where it's supposed to be. I worked with the electricians, so wherever current had to go on the ship, we had to go. Look above your head. You see the brackets and the cables in them? Those little brackets are from one end of the ship to the other. That was part of my job when I was helping to build them.
Working at the shipyard was more than just a job. It was a way for people who couldn't shoulder a rifle to still play a role in helping win the war. Women were no exception.
Roosevelt was a great president.
Thelma Welch Hodges, who just turned 100 years old, worked at the Southeastern Yard as a burner, cutting metal with an acetylene torch.
They wanted women. They needed women badly. All the men were going, and they advertised those that could work and didn't know how, they'd teach them.
Did you do the same work that the men did?
Absolutely. And we got the same pay. Yeah.
How much was the pay?
Started at 56 cents an hour, and when you're a first-class burner, you got $1.20. It didn't take me long to claim my share. I was doing the same as they were, so I went to them and said, I'm doing what he's doing. He gets $1.20 and I get 56. And they said, oh, we'll get that fixed. They fixed it.
Herbeth, I think this is the one.
Yeah.
Here I am.
Yeah.
For many, working in the shipyards was a family affair. The Surrency sisters, Laurie, Nanelle, and Carabeth, worked alongside their father and one brother at J.A. Jones in Brunswick. The girls were all welders.
We need to do something, and this is what we felt like we could do. And really we did. We took the places of guys that were drafted and, went off to war.
We felt like that we were called to work. And so like a preacher being called to preach, we felt like that, hey, this takes our top priority. And we worked, every time they needed an extra half shift or a shift and a half or whatever, 2 shifts, we would stay and pull that shift.
I love welding. I love to put that pretty flow of welding in there. And we were taught to do flat, vertical, and overhead. I worked everywhere from the bottom of the boat to the top of the mast pole. I was the only woman that would go to the top of the mast pole. I think the mast pole's about 60 foot above the top of the boat. All 6 ways I would move along with my crew until the boat went out for testing, and then they would mark the places that leaked. And then I was one of the ones that helped fix and repair the leaks when it came back in.
A lot depended on, you had it. You wanted it to be right, and yet you knew that the life of that ship was somewhat depending upon your ability to keep those 2 pieces of metal together so they would not leak.
Our years at the shipyard were beautiful. We did make sacrifices to go, as Sister said, and we felt like we were doing a part, to help. And it was just a big family. I thoroughly enjoyed every part of it.
For African Americans, the shipyards were a mixed blessing. Thousands of blacks went to work at yards and factories around the country, and a presidential order forbade discrimination in the workplace in companies that were manufacturing equipment for the war. Consequently, black workers practiced high-skilled trades at J.A. Jones Shipyard in Brunswick.
Well, we're just all Americans then. There wasn't no racism shown at that time. We had a job to do, and we done it.
And the people didn't try to like start no argument. Everybody got on white and black, no, like they didn't know it was time to do something. Either you dead, you know, the way they dumped them back that day. And it wasn't, if the water stayed on back that day, we'd have been integrated everywhere before Martin Luther King come through.
At Southeastern Shipyard in Savannah, however, discrimination continued at the hands of the white labor union, which reportedly kept blacks from climbing up from the lowest rungs on the ladder. Nonetheless, the black role in the war effort was an important precursor to the upcoming civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. It's important to note that Liberty ships were not the only vessels built on the Georgia coast during World War II. At the Savannah Machine and Foundry Yard owned by Walter Lee Mingledorff and his son, workers created 20 minesweepers for the U.S. Navy and another 6 for the British Royal Navy. The Coastal Heritage Society archives in Savannah contains a series of remarkable photos showing the yard, ships under construction, and workers toiling at various tasks inside the buildings. Another shipyard named McAvoy actually produced oil tankers that were made out of concrete. While that may seem bizarre to modern Americans, these unusual craft played a role in winning the war. The shipyards touched thousands of lives, even for people too young to work on the big freighters. Armstrong Atlantic State University history professor June Hopkins remembers watching as a Liberty named for her uncle, Stephen Hopkins, slid down the ways.
This was in February 1944. I was three and a half. I had recollections because it was such a defining moment because of the death of my uncle, and I remember him. And while it was a sad moment, it was also a celebratory time because we were recognizing the heroism of this young man and the honor of being able to dedicate this Liberty ship to his memory.
The memories come to life when Hopkins flips through the pages of a scrapbook the shipyard gave to her grandmother, which has now been passed down to her. It's a tool she uses to teach her students about World War II.
This makes the history come alive for my students. They realize that there is a connection between them in the classroom, me in front of the classroom, and the actual events.
At the J.A. Jones Shipyard in Brunswick, 12-year-old Reed Harris watched as his mother christened a Liberty ship early one morning.
Tide was wrong in the middle of the day, so they postponed it till about 1 or 2 in the morning. It came, woke me up, and went over and watched her crash that champagne against the bow of the ship. Champagne just flew all over everything. Bottle hit the bow of the ship and she's just covered with champagne. Oh my goodness, I was 12 years old and just watching that big old ship slide down into the water was something else.
Even though she was just a child when she helped launch the SS Crawford Long on New Year's Eve 1942, Audrey Platt, then Audrey Dunn, has detailed memories of the event.
I do remember really being terribly excited by the whole thing because the idea of christening a ship and having huge red roses and going out to this mysterious place with all these people. We'd never seen people like this before. I think a lot of people felt that way. It was sophistication coming to what we thought was the rural South now. People don't think of Savannah like that now, but then it was like magic.
Audrey was the maid of honor. Another young lady, Marilyn Milton from New York, actually broke the champagne across the ship's bow. Both of the young women were daughters of shipyard directors.
I think she was 12, which was really old, and she had on a suit, and I'd never had a suit, and she had on high heels and stockings, and I had on socks and Mary Jane shoes, and a cotton dress tied in the back, and long kinky hair. And she looked so stylish, and I was so humiliated, but thrilled, and I've never forgotten it. And those moments just stick in your life. These ships served their purpose, and we all felt that we were defeating a terrible enemy, which we did.
But even after the Georgia yards began cranking out Liberty ships, American sailors were still losing their lives at sea in German U-boat attacks. Savannah retiree Nick Craig, one of America's youngest merchant marine skippers during the war, remembers several attacks on his convoys.
We were attacked by a wolf pack, had a submarine fired a torpedo, went right across our bow and hit the ship alongside of us. And we no sooner had gotten back into the convoy and taken our position, and all of a sudden 2 ships were torpedoed in succession because the submarines had stayed underneath the convoy all night long, unbeknownst to anybody else. And one of them was a tanker, and I'll never forget that. The flames from that tanker was, thousands of feet in the air. Could see in the binoculars the guys all afire, jumping off. They said we're dead before they even hit the water. Awful, terrible sight.
The very first ship to slide down the ways at Southeastern Shipyard in Savannah, the SS James Oglethorpe, was sunk in one of the largest convoy battles in history on St. Patrick's Day in 1943. 38-year-old Anthony Joseph von Dalteren helped build the ship, then signed on as a member of its crew for a maiden voyage to Europe.
My oldest brother had talked my dad into signing for him to go in the Navy, and he did. And he was going to go overseas. And my dad had wrote Washington trying to get my brother out of the Navy because he was only 16. And so he couldn't hear anything. So he decided to get on that ship and go and find my brother.
The Oglethorpe's massive convoy crossed paths with dozens of Nazi U-boats that were waiting in ambush. Von Dalteren was one of more than 30 aboard the James Oglethorpe who perished in the cold waters of the North Atlantic.
It was a Monday night. On Sunday, my mother had a terrible premonition. And we wanted to go to the movies, and she just cried and cried and cried all day. And this terrible premonition she had, something was wrong. And there was a knock. And he said that he had a telegram for Miss Von Dalteren. And I took it, walked over to a corner lamp and opened that and read down where it said, missing and presumed lost. And we just lost it. And it was horrible. Our dad was gone. I mean, we felt like, he was gone from that telegram.
The Liberty ships did sail with some protection from attack. Sailors in the Naval Armed Guard manned several heavy machine guns mounted on the decks of the ships. All were volunteers. There was little glory in the dangerous job. Savannah retiree Bill Frick commanded one such crew.
I got my basic Navy training at Princeton University, and the choice was the PT boats, Armed Guard, or the Supply Corps. And when the professor mentioned that the Armed Guard gave you your own private room aboard and you were the boss of the crew, I raised my hand and volunteered to be in the Armed Guard. The merchant ships had artillery, and they had to have Navy people to fire the artillery and take care of them. And the regular size crew was 1 Navy officer, the gunnery officer, and 26 enlisted men to man the guns. I'd have to be up on the bridge with the skipper and the first mate at sunrise, and then again at sunset. That seemed to be the 2 most opportune times for the Japanese to send some planes over.
Frick's trial by fire did not come from Nazi subs. Instead, it was delivered by a Japanese dive bomber during a mission to the Philippines in 1944.
I remember the day, was because I've always said my day in infamy was December the 5th, because that's the time that the first and only attack was on my ship and our convoy. I, of course, had called general quarters, and all our guns were manned, and all of them were firing like mad. And we so happened that we had 700 troops aboard. And after the thing was over, we got through safely. Well, they said, nice shooting, you got us here first, because a couple of ships in the convoy did get hit. Well, what it looked like to me was one guy in a cockpit and a great big bomb hanging underneath him, and you were naturally hoping that you weren't the one that got the bomb. And the closest one I think hit us was he was coming fairly low over our ship, and I watched that guy drop that bomb, and it scooted through the water and missed most of the ships. It really did, and finally it caught one. And whether that ship ever sank or not, I'm not sure, but I remember thinking, boy, that was the one that was meant for us, and I think we're going to be free now. And it worked out that was true.
It's been famously said that combat is weeks of boredom punctuated by moments of sheer terror. In Frick's case, there were moments of foxhole humor as well.
In addition to carrying troops, one time we had 40,000 cases of beer on board to take to the troops in the Philippines. And we got under attack as we were approaching them, and the first mate said, Mr. Frick, if I don't make it through this, I'd like for you to see that I get a proper epitaph. And I said, what do you want to be, Chief? He said, I wanted to say the chief mate lies buried here. He died defending a case of beer.
The Liberties were also protected by small Navy surface vessels, destroyers and frigates that escorted them on their missions. Savannah retiree Al Ianson sailed on one such warship, the USS Kidd, guarding huge convoys of dozens of ships in the North Atlantic.
It was 1942. I was a high school senior, and they said, how would you fellas all like to get your diploma right now? Everybody said, yay, don't have to wait till June. And I said, you know, Ma, I'm going to get my diploma right now instead of waiting till June. Her remark was, gee, I knew you were very smart. I said, all I have to do is join the Navy. She said, what? Now I know you're dumb. Anyway, I finally wore them down, and they signed for me, and I enlisted in the Navy at 17. There was one situation where they estimated there were 5 to 7 German submarines in the middle of our convoy. And we started off with 35 ships. We lost 15 on the way. We had to get the casualties out of the water within 15 minutes, or you might as well leave them there. Hypothermia set in very fast. Sometimes the people were saved by the coatings of oil that they had on them from the sinking ships. And as a 17-year-old, I was seeing all of these ships go down with all this deck cargo and all, that we're not going to win this war if we keep it up this way. And I stood watches on the bridge where I practically froze to death. We had face masks on where we stood watch on the wing of the bridge for 1 hour, and then 1 hour in the pilot house coming back to life, getting the ice off you. Then we were transferred to the south, which was a pleasant relief, although a transfer I had been put in for to go into the engine room where it was warm because I was always freezing up in the bridge, came through, and when it came through, we headed for the Pacific, where it was 135 degrees in the engine room.
Other Liberty ship Guardians patrolled from high above the convoys in massive Navy blimps. More than 100 of these lighter-than-air warships floated above the U.S. East, West, and Gulf coasts, protecting American and Allied ships and searching for enemy subs.
From 43 to...
Effingham County retiree Paul Settlemeyer crewed several blimps during the war.
We generally take off about 6 o'clock in the morning, and the flight lasts till almost dark. And what we're doing, we're escorting a convoy of ships. Sometimes one ship, many ships sometimes. It looked like a mass of ships out there. Just, you could see them for miles and miles, just making their way. We never patrolled at nighttime that I can remember, because we couldn't see nothing. Say you couldn't see nothing. After we left, they were on their own, and we could spot a submarine, and we were real slow. And we had some sonar that we could pick up that sub. Sometimes we'd drop a bomb. Sometimes you would see an oil slick come.
In all, Navy blimps escorted more than 80,000 American and Allied ships during the war, losing not a single one to an enemy sub and saving countless lives. Of course, a Liberty ship voyage wasn't always dangerous or even exciting, but it was almost always memorable.
68th Medical Supply Depot.
Retired St. Simon's music minister Joe Walters began his World War II overseas deployment on a Liberty. The 16-year-old National Guardsman was jammed onto a Liberty ship with 300 other soldiers for a 3-week-long trip between San Francisco and New Zealand.
We were on the ship for 21 days. There were about 30 of us sleeping in bunks, stacks of 5, from floor to the ceiling, and very close quarters. I mean, you couldn't rise up in your bed. You had to just slide out. It was boring on the ship, and one man, the man that I mentioned, 35, had been to college and seminary, and he was quite a Bible student. So we had Bible classes, and that was a big help. Some men like to play cards, and I just loved at night looking at the stars.
When the war ended in 1945, business dried up at Southeastern and J.A. Jones.
I remember that morning, all of us went down there that day, and that ship, last one they sent out, and everybody was standing out there on the marge. And when she went going out around the St. Simon, and everybody went to patting the hand and shutting down. That's the last time we saw one of them, J.A. Jones Shipyard.
Before long, the yards themselves had crumbled into ruins, hardly whispering the story of the massive efforts that took place here. There are reminders, a large Liberty ship model on the waterfront in downtown Brunswick, another inside the Ships of the Sea Museum in Savannah, and a flower-covered anchor shut up inside a cabinet at an American Legion Hall there. Eventually, the Liberty ships themselves began to vanish as well. Of the hundreds that survived the war, most were scrapped in the 1960s and 70s.
After the war, because they were inefficient, they only go 10 knots speedily, and they had the old up and down reciprocating engine, where the newer ships were all turbines and needed faster speed and whatever. So they weren't economical to run as a normal shipping operation.
In Baltimore, Maryland, Mike Schneider heads up a team of volunteers that lovingly preserves the SS John W. Brown, one of just 2 Liberties left in existence today.
I think most people are drawn down here for one of several reasons. One is the idea of historical preservation and to keep alive a ship. People who have been in the Navy or the Merchant Marine or worked in a shipyard are drawn to the ship. I think there are a lot of people who think it's important to keep this ship going as a memorial to shipyard workers, to merchant mariners, and to members of the Naval Armed Guard are down here for that reason. Well, I think all of us here have an appreciation for the sacrifices made by the merchant mariners and the Naval Armed Guard in World War II. They didn't get a lot of credit. The Naval Armed Guard is one of the lesser known organizations within the Navy. As I think you and most everybody knows now, the merchant mariners were not recognized as veterans until 1988, although they had a casualty rate that was equivalent with the U.S. Marine Corps. Well, I think like anybody who was part of World War II, we owe them a great debt. As history moves on, we tend to forget what happened in the past or pay less attention to it. I think if you look in schools, there's less and less time devoted to World War II history. But like Brokaw's book, The Greatest Generation, I think we owe them a great deal. And I think that one of the ways that we here in Project Liberty Ship try to continue that is to preserve this ship, give them an opportunity to see how those people, see what they built, see how they lived, how they went to sea. We're entering the engine room now. As we come down at the first level, you see the top of the 3-cylinder reciprocating steam engine. These steam engines were obsolete by the time the Liberty ships were built, but they were available, and with all the ship construction going on in World War II, the Liberty ships ended up with reciprocating steam engines. Liberty ships did not go very fast. Top speeds around 10 or 11 knots. This engine developed 2,500 horsepower. So they were not fast, but they were fast enough to keep up with the convoys. Convoy speed was 8 or 9 knots. Liberty ship would do 10 or 11, so it could maintain station satisfactorily in a convoy. The thing that I would describe it is it's extremely reliable. This engine has been operating for 65 years. It requires a little maintenance, but hasn't had any major repairs that we're aware of. You warm it up properly, you put steam to it, and it provides reliable propulsion.
Project Liberty Ship, the nonprofit that operates the John W. Brown, raises needed funds by hosting paid day cruises aboard ship.
I think when the veterans come aboard, it's a very, very meaningful experience for them. I mentioned that I work in the engine room. When you see the engineers who sailed these ships during the war come back and watch the plant in operation, reciprocating steam engine, see the sounds and the smells and all the action down there, it just brings tears to their eyes. They get down there, they don't want to leave. It's something that was an important part of their life, and it's very nostalgic. Same thing up on deck. An awful lot of people bring families, and it's the one opportunity they have to explain to their families, particularly grandchildren, the things that they did during the war, where they worked, where they lived, where they ate, and just to walk around in a ship that's exactly like the ship that they served on.
Of the more than 2,000 Liberty ships which did not survive the 20th century, not all ended up as scrap metal. Many were sunk off America's coast and have second lives now as artificial reefs.
In the 1970s, there was an act called the Liberty Ship Act, which was passed, which made these ships available to the states for reefing, for artificial reef use. And so various states got our Liberty ships. The Liberty ships back then were the big thing. Everybody wanted them. And so they sort of are the foundation of the reef system, more or less.
Authorities sank 2 Liberties, the Savannah-built Addie Bagley Daniels and the Edwin S. Nettleton, off the Georgia coast in the mid-1970s. Before the ships could be sent to the bottom, workers had to remove the engines, fuel, and other contaminants. Plus, a significant portion of the vessel's upper decks were cut down as well.
The Liberty ships were going into a depth of about 70 foot of water. That was as deep as we could, otherwise we would have to go way offshore. So in order to do that, though, we had to cut them down to about the 3rd deck.
Thousands of fish dart in and out of the strong currents, hiding inside the walls of the ships.
Divers like wrecks, fishermen like wrecks. They attract different types of fish. When you go down, it's massive. It's just the size of it, and then just I think the thing that impressed me most was seeing the great schools of fish around it, like the hundreds, literally hundreds of barracuda, amberjack, all around, and it just hit you. It's just beautiful.
The story of the Liberty ships in coastal Georgia is one of triumph and tragedy, of victory and great personal loss. And now the same ships that brought tens of thousands of jobs to the area are playing a new role in preserving valuable fisheries offshore. Coastal Georgians of today can take pride in the ships and in the yards that built them.
Seemed to me like it was a pretty good place to work at that time.
These ships served their purpose. They were not warships, and I know a lot of them met not a very pretty end, but there were lots of them made very fast for a war purpose, and we were pretty proud.
That was a big part of the war effort, getting supplies to Europe. They were taking the loads to feed the troops and arm the troops. And I think everybody was, proud of the part that was being played to the war effort.
So it was an amazing effort, and one that people took a lot of pride in to work in those shipyards, because they knew in their heart they were making just as valuable a contribution to the World War II effort as the men on the fighting front. And this to me is the remarkable example of what we call the greatest generation.